This is a brand new workshop. We have never held this workshop before, and one of the reasons why we wanted to put it together for you is that, as you know, as you've been watching the news, the issue of abortions in the last trimester have become a rather hot topic. And there are lots of facets to abortions in the later term. First of all, they do happen. They are real. And secondly, the stories are varied, but one of the main narratives that we hear about are medically necessary, or that there's something medically wrong with the child, or and that is a purpose to, and a reason and a justification for abortion. And that is part of what we're going to focus on in this workshop. And I think that we are a nation that likes visuals and we like stories. And so this is a workshop that we are going to tell stories. And I hope that it is a good experience for you. So our two speakers are Samantha Williams and Heather Hobbs. And Samantha lives, well, not too far from here, actually. And we first met in a coffee shop about a year ago, and she told me her story. And she graduated from George Fox University and worked at the Portland Clinic before she became a stay-at-home mom to her two beautiful kids. And as part of her story, Samantha has really experienced a lot of grief related to pregnancy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just saw immediately her heart to utilize her experiences to help people see the humanity of her children, but also to know that even in a lot of grief and pain, there is hope. So, and our other speaker today, we made really awesome packets for the other workshop moderators, and then didn't make one for me because I'm the boss, right? I don't need one. So our other speaker is Heather Hobbs, who hails from Klamath Falls and is the mom of 4 amazing children. She just sent me these amazing pictures of all of them that are like their model children, but she has a very powerful story that she has been sharing around the country, most recently in South Dakota, again of hope. And her passion is really to provide practical help for women, and she does that in all kinds of ways. In addition to her pro-life work, she works on human trafficking, domestic violence, and other issues related to, that we know, related to abortion, because many times women in those situations feel highly pressured to have abortion. So they have wonderful, varied backgrounds, and I'm pleased that both of them have agreed to share their stories this morning. And we are going to start with Heather. Come on up, Heather.
Hi there, how's everyone doing? It's close to lunchtime. Getting the hangries yet? Yeah? So as Lois said, I am Heather Hobbs. It's not a fake name, that's my real name. And I do have 4 children, and they are absolutely amazing. I was raised as a pro-choice atheist, and we very much were raised to support abortion in our home. And it wasn't until later on as a young adult that I actually had to face that question in my face, rather than, do you support a woman's right to choose? Do you support them having control over their bodies? And, the forced birth language now wasn't around back then. Back then they said safe, legal, rare all the time. And now we're going towards full term, anytime, taxpayer funded. And Oregon is, I believe when I checked last time, the only state that has 0 restrictions on abortion. And for me, that's really devastating, because I know people that are voting for this type of, service, as they call it. But you and I know that it's ending a human life, that it's killing a person who is conceived, and their personhood status does not change whether they're inside the woman's body or outside of the body. And Oregon has pushed it one step further. And where they've pushed it into is we are now funding illegal immigrant abortions, we are funding abortions for women from out of state, and the Hyde Amendment is really ineffective here. And that's what they want to be nationwide, right? We are saying it's between the woman and her doctor. Well, the reason why I came into this is because 3 of those 4 children were recommended by doctors to be aborted. And the first time was when I was 19 and I conceived in rape. And the doctor said, I don't believe in abortions at all, except for in this circumstance. And so that's ultimately what led me to want to protect life, want to speak out for life, but I was still kind of doing it passively by donating to a pregnancy resource center or donating to foster care, and I was helping out with domestic violence shelters, but still, it was just in my free time. Because as a mom, many of you know, it's a hard juggle, getting the groceries, taking the kids to this or that. And I became pro-life from my first child. But I still thought that in some medical situations, perhaps it would be justified or okay. And so then came my second. And I always joke around and say that God gave me a girl first because he knew I couldn't handle boys without a dad in the picture. Yes, they're always wild. And so I went septic with my second pregnancy. And initially they said, obviously you've miscarried, your white blood cell count is through the roof. And so we were getting papers ready to perform the procedure to remove my baby. And I just had this moment where I thought, I have to see for sure. And they likely would have done an ultrasound, but we were preparing to put me under because I didn't want to be awake for it. And we saw not only was he alive, but he was having a dance party. He was moving and kicking, and I was like, well, he's clearly not dead. And so those doctors the entire time focused on the pregnancy. They didn't explore any other options for repeat sepsis. I had antibiotics, hospitalization, IV fluids, sent home, sepsis come back not very long after, a couple weeks each time. And it became so difficult because I felt like I was talking to a wall. Please check out other things. I don't think it's my baby. Well, we've been taught to just trust doctors and that take their word as if it's God. And, science, as we know now, does support life. But at that time, we didn't have as much advocacy as we do now. It wasn't in the national news because it wasn't a big debate topic then. And I finally switched doctors after we moved to Oregon because I was in Omaha, Nebraska. And that doctor, within a week, found out that I had gallstones that caused acute pancreatitis. And had they found it early on in the pregnancy, I could have safely had surgery without harming my baby. But now we were at a point where I was too far along. And so the doctor said, you can either be closely monitored 2 times a week for the ultrasound, keep up with your labs. It's going to be stressful, they said, but we can do this. You can hold on as long as you need to. If you're willing to do it, then we can induce you when your body cannot take it anymore. And so that was around 23 weeks or so. He didn't have much of a chance back then. And I said, all right, I'm going to tough it out and I'm going to try and we'll see what happens. And he was born at OHSU on my birthday, October 29th, 2013. And he's now a very healthy 6-year-old boy. My daughter's turning 12 this year. And with these 2, I thought, well, surely I guess I'm done. But of course, God had other plans, and it was a beautiful plan because that is the reason, this 3rd pregnancy, why I speak out against abortion, why I speak out for women, victims of human trafficking, providing resources, counseling, therapy. All those things are pivotal and important to helping these women see that abortion is not only not necessary, but we have a community there to help you with that. And our son Gideon was recommended for a late-term abortion. I had a perfect pregnancy. It was so funny because I told my doctor a little after the 20-week ultrasound that I felt like something was off. And she said, Heather, you've had 2 complicated pregnancies before. It's only natural that as you progress in this pregnancy that you would feel stressed. And so I said, okay, I'm just stressed. And in 10 days' time, I'd gained 20 pounds. And I've never gained much during my pregnancy. I'm that one that gets really annoying because I just don't look pregnant, and then all of a sudden I look pregnant. And so 20 pounds was a big deal, especially in 10 days. And my doctor agreed that this is concerning. And we did an ultrasound, and there was this black circle within my baby's abdomen. And it just looked like a black circle, a perfect line. It was very unclear what that could be. And my primary OB said, I've never seen this before. So they sent it to maternal fetal medicine in Medford, Oregon. They didn't know what it was, so they asked me to come over the hill and get imaging at their place because they said they have better imaging. So I went over there, and they sent the images to OHSU. OHSU didn't know what it was, so they sent it to Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And Mayo Clinic got back and said, this is a fatal diagnosis. Her baby's going to die, and she's at high risk of dying herself if she doesn't have an abortion. And, they didn't call it an abortion. They said, terminating of an unviable fetus. They said incompatible with life. They used this language that tries to make the woman feel like that's not a person. But the reality is, that's a person. And this was about 24 weeks by the time we finally figured out what it was. And the simplified version is his intestines burst in his abdomen, and then his body built a calcified shell around it, and it's called meconium pseudocyst. And it fills with infection, and it's really a gross picture, but if you guys ever want to see it, I will share it with you. But they said that he had to be aborted. And for me, as someone who had complicated pregnancies, as someone who had a lot of friends that are doctors and nurses, as someone who had paramedic training, as I did when I was younger, I didn't understand why we couldn't just monitor closely, like with my last one, doing blood work, doing regular visits. And so maternal fetal medicine were the ones that really pressured the abortion. But my primary OB at that time very much supported me maintaining the pregnancy and being seen all the time. And so that meant 3 days a week in Medford, 2 days a week in Klamath Falls where I live. And if anything crazy happened on Saturday and Sunday, go to labor and delivery. And there's chart notes there what to do. And so as they kept pushing and pushing for abortion, it was very emotionally difficult to know that you have a baby with a name, a baby that could potentially be viable, and you have these other doctors that are pressuring you to end that life. And you feel that life growing within you. And you know that there's another option. And so my primary OBGYN called OHSU and said, this is what's happening. This is what the maternal fetal medicine doctors want. This is what we have to deal with. Will you please take her if she goes into labor? And so OHSU agreed to try. And that's all that I wanted, was to try. And I said that I can make peace if my baby dies on his own, but I cannot make peace with the fact that if I said he's going to die by giving the doctors authorization to do that. And so it was amazing. My son was born at 27 weeks and 5 days, and I had to be on a life flight because it was blizzarding, and you guys know Klamath and Portland aren't next door neighbors. And my husband wasn't allowed to go on the flight because it was too small, so he got stuck through snow and traffic. And I delivered a little boy who was purple. I mean, he literally was purple. And everybody was so shocked. They just kind of stared at him for a minute, and then they took him away. And they wouldn't tell me how he was doing. And I just said, I just want to know if he's still alive. He's still alive, because he looked like he was already dead. And my husband finally got there. We said a prayer. We asked the doctors to please try. The pediatric surgeon said, are you sure you want me to even bother? And I said, again, I can deal with it if he dies on his own. I cannot deal with it if you guys don't try. And so Gideon was in the NICU at OHSU Dornbeckers for about 5 months. He had many surgeries. He was discharged, and then a week later, we back at Dornbeckers again. And he was in the hospital in and out collectively for about a year in his first 15 months of life. And I disagreed with the diagnosis that they had for him afterwards. They said he had cystic fibrosis, but he didn't have a copy from me or a copy from my husband. He passed all of his pancreatic sufficiency testing, and he passed the sweat chloride testing. So he in no way fit the parameters of cystic fibrosis. And the doctors, again, didn't listen to me, and I took him to Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and they agreed that his medicines that they had him on for cystic fibrosis were keeping him sick. And they also said that if we get away from the medicines and we start these nutrition shakes, which are called Kate Farms, that he would likely get better. And so that trip, even though it was really expensive, even though it was crazy to go across the country with a camper and a dog and 3 little kids, we did it, and it saved his life. And now he's a happy, thriving, just turned 4 on February 3rd, just turned 4, little boy, and he is testing at very high skill level for his language and listening. And they said he likely would have vision problems, but he did not. He passed all the retinopathy. Excuse me. Thank you. And so Gideon is 4. He has big, beautiful blonde curls, beautiful blue eyes, and since then has also had a baby sister who, her name is Ellie, and she's the same size as him. But all of them, all of my children, they've changed who I was in a positive way. And what I've learned about late-term abortions is it's painted as a medical service, when in reality it's not. There's no situation. If a woman is in an emergent state, if she's bleeding or if she's got, sepsis, you never stop treating the mother to go and kill her child. And there's always that option to closely monitor her, admit her. If the baby passes on their own, then that's what happens, but you never go and try to kill her baby. And late-term abortions are extremely risky to the mother. So for me, as someone who's experienced these things firsthand, living in a state like this, seeing so many women who are scared, we know that abortion is fear-based. They will play on the fears and pressure someone into something, and that something is killing her child. And in no way does that help her. Her risk of suicide goes up exponentially, her risk of breast cancer. There's so many statistics and studies that show late-term abortion is not a good thing, and yet still it's being advocated for all across this country. And so that's what I'm doing here today. I came up here partly because I love my friends at Oregon Right to Life, but also I came here to share this message that my 4 beautiful children, they are people with a face, with a name, and their location should not change that. Them being in or out of my body does not define who they are. And we need to have no exceptions, no discrimination for all people. The law should protect all people. And this is a human rights issue. This is not a women's right issue. This is something that we all have to step up and fight against. And I pray and hope that I can raise my children in a world where we do not discriminate based upon age, gender, their race, or disability, or the way that they were conceived. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this over, but I wanted to thank you guys all for hearing my story, and I hope that you guys, if you come across a woman who is going through this, that you'll help her, you'll bring a community around her and show her what a loving option is. The loving option is you keep your baby, you grow your baby, we'll help you, we'll be here for you. Pregnancy resource centers, they're not as highly advertised as Planned Parenthood, and we know that. And so it's up to us to step up. It's up to us to be there for her, to help her with her baby. And if she ends up choosing adoption, we need to support her there too. So I hope that you guys will join me with that and helping the women of Oregon choose life and helping to bring an end to abortion. Thank you.
All right, come on up, Samantha. We're going to do a little Q&A format here. Do you want to hold it or stand? Okay. Well, first of all, why don't you tell us? Oh, I'll hand it to you when you need it.
Thank you.
Okay. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family and your background?
As Lois mentioned earlier, my name is Samantha, and I've been married to my husband Kirk for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years in June, and we have a daughter who is going to be 7 tomorrow, actually, and a son who turned 2 in December. And then we have 2 children who Jesus called home early due to an ectopic pregnancy and a miscarriage.
So we're going to talk about your 4th pregnancy, and as you've already talked about with, you had your daughter, and then you had an ectopic pregnancy and then a miscarriage, and so the leading up to your 20-week ultrasound and having a healthy pregnancy so far must have been an emotional and exciting time. Why don't you tell us about that day?
So everything was going great in my 4th pregnancy up until our 20-week ultrasound, when we went to our appointment, excited to see the gender of our baby. And the technician didn't say anything, but we went to meet with our doctor, and she said, well, there's 3 concerning images. The first one is there's a focus in the heart, which just means there's a bright spot that people believe there's small deposits of calcium in the heart. It's questionable whether the fingertips are curved in your son's hand, and he's measuring 1 week behind in his growth. And all of these could indicate that he could be born with Down syndrome. We weren't at a high risk for this because of our family history, because of our lifestyle, because of our age, but it doesn't mean that it's not spontaneous, and he could just be born with that. There's other issues he could have had, but at that time, that was the most obvious sign that they were seeing. And up until that point, I've always been pro-life, but my doctor looked at me and said, so with this news, what would you like to do about this? And it was kind of like right there, I had the choice if I wanted to continue or just end the pregnancy. And I looked at her and said, I can't have this baby, but I can't not have this baby. Because again, I've always been pro-life, but when you're faced with something altering your future forever, it's not so easy to make that choice. I've always been one to point a finger at people who did choose to abort, but suddenly when my future was, the possibility of it being altered forever was pointing at me, it changes the way you see it. And so I really did, at that point, consider abortion for a short time.
You had mentioned to me before, I think you've seen in your book, that your husband wasn't with you. So how did that discussion go when you saw him and told him how things went? It was probably very different than what he anticipated.
Yes. Well, he did actually end up being able to come to that appointment, but later. But it was kind of like I was having this out-of-body experience where I knew the doctor was talking, but everything was fuzzy. There was ringing in my ears. It was just unbelievable thinking that this could be happening to us. And when my husband and I talked about it, I would have to say for him, his opinion never changed. He was always, this is our child, we're having this baby. But for me, I was terrified. I didn't know what my life was going to look like. I already had a daughter, and motherhood was overwhelming to me at times anyways, and thinking of taking on something more was just even more overwhelming to me. And I felt terrible for even considering aborting him, but it really did run through my mind. And it took us, my husband and I, several days working through that to decide, what are we thinking? This is our son. This is our child. Of course we want to have him. Like, God knows what he's doing. He's fully equipped us as parents to parent this child, condition or not. And so we made that choice. We're keeping him.
And what was the follow-up? There seemed like there was a lot of medical appointments and things that happened pretty quickly after you had that first ultrasound.
So after the first ultrasound, we were actually sent to a high-risk clinic the very next day to have a repeat ultrasound. And within 24 hours, 2 out of the 3 soft markers were gone. So when they did the ultrasound, the focus in the heart was not there. They read it wrong. The second marker, the questionable curved fingertips, they weren't sure because our son always had his hand in a fist or in a weird spot. Well, the doctor decided to perform the ultrasound, and it still kind of makes me tear up because while the doctor was looking at the ultrasound, our son just opened his hand like this. It still makes me so emotional, but they weren't curved at all. So the only thing was that he was still measuring a week behind. And so because of that, we had to be monitored closely, and we had to go to the high-risk clinic then from the rest of our pregnancy till he was born 2 to 3 times a week. And by the time that he was close to being born, he was born at 34 weeks. He was measuring 6.5 weeks behind in his arms and legs, and he was 3.5 weeks behind in his head and 2.5 weeks behind in his stomach. And so Down syndrome had kind of been ruled out because he didn't have other indicators of that, but there was a strong possibility, a 70% chance actually, that he was going to be born with achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism, there were other risk factors too, but that was the biggest one. And so still knowing that, they also told us that there was a 20% chance he would be stillborn, not being able to survive going into labor or whatever was causing that, but we still, knowing that, knew that, like, again, God knows what he's doing, and this is our child, and we're not changing our minds.
Yeah, that's for sure. So what was their eventual diagnosis?
Well, that's kind of what the big question was, is we opted out of doing genetic testing, the amniocentesis, which is what would have told us with 100% accuracy if he was going to have achondroplasia or Down syndrome or a couple other genetic issues that were really big. We decided not to because there's a chance that you can go into preterm labor. And with my first child, my daughter, I actually did go into preterm labor. So we just thought, we're having him and we're expecting there to be something. And so we're okay with that and we're just going to trust God. And so we didn't do that. So the biggest one still was achondroplasia, but it was also kind of this up in the air where it was still really unclear what was causing it because we didn't have any of the risk factors and nothing was really adding up. So there was another possibility that it was just my placenta not functioning properly and it was just kind of a spontaneous thing. But we wouldn't know until he was born and kind of essentially just looking at him and seeing what was going on from there.
And did you guys talk to the doctors in the clinic? Did they know that you guys had made a decision to continue with your pregnancy and with your baby's development?
Yes. So every single week we were asked if we would like to continue the pregnancy based on our findings. Every week the news was just getting worse and the look on the doctors' faces was always really grim. And although we still were standing firm in our decision to keep him, there were lots of times where I was thinking in the back of my head, didn't they know something that we don't know? You know, are we crazy that we're not aborting him? I think in the world we live in now, it's so easy to discard something. You know, we want perfection, and now especially with children, we can achieve perfection through lots of different genetic testing, through all sorts of things. And it's just really sad that we're given that option and that we're pressured in that way, that we were pressured in that way every week, even though they knew our wishes and we weren't changing our mind, yet still it was on the table. And it's just really sad.
You mentioned that you were going to the high-risk pregnancy clinic quite often, and how did that disrupt your life, and what was it like to have to be in a medical environment so often?
It was horrible, and I still have PTSD from it a little bit, but my daughter at the time was 4, and so she had to move in with my parents because not during that time when we were going to the hospital, but eventually I was admitted to the hospital for 2 weeks before he was born. But she had to stay at my parents a lot as we were going to appointments, and I just felt like I was just kind of mourning this pregnancy that I thought I was going to have, so in a sense sort of depressed, but also trying to be a mom for my daughter and still be present and just get through being pregnant and trying to think about what our life might look like after our son was born. And when we got up to the point where they were monitoring us, going to the hospital, I had to do ultrasounds weekly to monitor his growth, and then also non-stress tests to see how his heart was doing. And they said at any point you need to have your bags packed because you never know when we're going to ask you to stay here. And so it was kind of like every appointment I didn't know will I be coming home after this. And so that was also really stressful. And at 32 weeks pregnant, that day came where they said he's in a critical condition and you need to be staying at the hospital now. And so I was admitted to the hospital where I stayed there for 2 weeks until he was born. I forgot to mention that the slow growth that they diagnosed me with was called intrauterine growth restriction. And so that's what they were saying was causing the slow growth, other than the genetic component to it that they were saying was most likely. But I was in the hospital being monitored very closely, his heartbeat, his oxygen, all of those things. And at 34 weeks, they decided that he had reached the most critical state where he would no longer do best growing inside me. He needed to grow outside of me. And so they had a C-section at 34 weeks at that time.
Wow. And I mentioned to you as I was reading your book, I was so shocked when you describe they were getting ready, they were prepping you to give you the C-section, and the doctor said, he still has a 20% chance of being stillborn. Do you still want to go through with this?
Yes.
And as I know that at the time you must have been like an out-of-body experience. You're not really paying attention. But as you've looked back on that, and as you went through writing your book and processing that, how do you process that, and how do you feel about that experience?
Again, it's really upsetting because we had told them countless times that we were having him. We've come this far, we're keeping him. And when he was born, I wasn't able to see him because having a C-section, they have a big screen above you. And I asked my husband, well, first of all, all I wanted to do was just to hear him cry because I knew there was this chance that wouldn't even be happening. So the second I heard us cry, I knew he's alive. And then I asked my husband, what does he look like? And he's like, he looks like our son. And, I just knew, yeah, that's exactly it. And there was several members from the NICU staff there waiting to take him. He was having a little trouble breathing, and so they took a quick picture. I still didn't get to see him, but there's 5 people around him getting ready to put him in his incubator. And he was taken off, and I had to wait several hours before I was able to see him. But we asked the doctor at the NICU, after looking at him, and he looked completely healthy to me. And we found out that actually what I ended up having was preeclampsia, and he was perfectly proportional. I mean, there was nothing off whatsoever. And because I had preeclampsia, he was never going to have a genetic condition. It was purely placental. It just wasn't functioning properly. So there was no intrauterine growth restriction after all. And to think, had I chose to listen to them, to think maybe he would have Down syndrome or achondroplasia and got scared, I would have never known. And even if he was born with that, it would still be okay because he's our son. And so it's just really sad that they give you that option all the way up until you're ready to deliver, because they were completely wrong. And even if not, you can handle it. It's your child. It's just not something you can discard.
And I think just to kind of review, so we have perspective, you went in and had, you were around 20 weeks when you had the first ultrasound, and then Easton was born at how many weeks?
34 weeks.
34 weeks. So this was all in the later part of your pregnancy, yes. all of this. So.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you in particular, since one of the things that I'm hoping that we'll get out of this as well from both of you is when we experience this kind of traumatic pregnancy, whether it's ourselves or whether it's a family member or even a friend, someone we know, what are some things that we should do and things that we shouldn't do?
I think it's always really hard when someone's going through something really traumatic. We don't know what to do, so we kind of just stay silent. And I think that it's hard to know because everyone is different, but for me, I really appreciated people not staying silent, the people that reached out, and even though they had things going on in their lives, they still let me know that they were thinking about me, that asked how my doctor appointments went, because what I was going through was very heartbreaking, and it was just so nice to know that people just weren't moving on with their lives and forgetting about me. And then also praying for me. I had so many people stop me at the grocery store, at my daughter's preschool at the time, and place their hand on my belly and just pray over my son. And that was so nice to think that they're thinking of me and that, God is moving in big ways. So just not staying silent and just, praying for them.
Thank you, Samantha. Is there anything else that you thought of?
Well, I just wanted to say that Easton is here.
Yeah,
my son
that's
is here.
right. Exhibit
you can
A.
see him, but he was born at 3.5 pounds, and he was in the NICU for a month, and absolutely thriving, healthy. You would never know that he was ever, it could have been a different outcome. But yeah, my husband's out there with him because he's 2 in total toddler phase right now. My daughter's here too, but.
So we'll bring him up here. But if you guys have some questions, let's see, Cindy's still here. Cindy will come and gather those up, and we'll welcome Heather back up here, and hopefully have a good Q&A discussion session.
That's my son.
So cute. All done.
You would have never known.
All done.
Yeah, I'm all done.
Hey, Easton.
Do you want me to say hi?
She still has a little bit of things to do. She'll be okay.
The question is, could preeclampsia have been treated had it been diagnosed earlier? And that's a definite possibility, yes, it could have. But I'm so thankful that there was that concern of possible Down syndrome at the time because of those 3 soft indicators. Since 2 of them were gone within 24 hours, had we only just had that Easton was measuring a week behind in his arms and legs, they wouldn't have monitored us because that's not a red flag at the time. So it's kind of scary to think that because it was my placenta not functioning properly, that maybe something would have happened that wasn't good at the end, but because of that, they were watching us. So yes, had they diagnosed it correctly, they could have changed things certainly, but it's hard to say.
This one is for Heather. So, how did your family, or they also said parents, but feel when you kept your babies?
So it's a tricky question because of, the differences in how I was raised and what they believe. And, as my friend Samantha here was speaking, with Gideon, I had preeclampsia as well, and with 2 of my pregnancies, I had something called cholestasis. And when she was up here talking about it, it just all hit me about how unsupportive my family was and how I felt very alone with a lot of the friends that I had because, most people think if there's something wrong with the baby, as she said, they're wanting a perfect child, then you shouldn't have that child. And so for me, my own mother, I actually had her come and meet our son because she was very critical of our child and how I would be forcing him to live and I would be forcing him to stay alive and be basically tortured. Like her mindset really believed that having a child that was on life support or shouldn't be born, that there was no reason to support his life. And when she even came and saw him in person, her boss gave her 3 weeks and said, nope, you're gonna go see your grandson, I'll pay for it. She saw him and she's like, why are you keeping him on life support? Because for the whole first 4 weeks of his life, he was on something called TPN. And that's basically like an IV nutrition. It's very hard on the liver, and you're only supposed to be on it for short periods, and here he was on a long-term period of TPN. And, you know, it hurt me, because I'm thinking, this is your grandchild. This is a person that you can see. This is no longer this invisible, we don't act like it's a baby because it's in my body thing. This is a person right in front of you. And she still believed that I was forcing the doctors to essentially torture him and force him to live. And I even questioned myself at that 4 weeks. I prayed. I asked, God, am I torturing my baby? Am I forcing him to live for selfish reasons? Am I being selfish that I won't let go? And I felt very strongly that we need to protect life from conception to natural death. And it doesn't really, it's not, I'm so sorry, it's not even a question. If we have the technology to help people live, we need to utilize it. We don't just give up because it's hard or because there's pain. We never give up until that person goes on their own. And so with my family, there was no support, but with my mother-in-law, she's like a saint in many ways. She supported us. She loved us. She took care of our 2 kids so my husband could keep working. She was there to help out with going back and forth from Klamath to Portland. So for my family, there wasn't that support, but I do have a wonderful mother-in-law, and our church community really helped out a lot.
This question is for Samantha. At the late-term abortion clinic where we pray, there are sometimes cases where a couple are there due to a diagnosis. How can we be of help in that situation and try to save that life?
That's a good question. I mean, I think just as I mentioned, just being there for them and not forcing your opinions on them, because I mentioned I really did consider aborting him. And so if someone were to tell me at that time that was pro-life, even though I am pro-life, it's different when it's happening to you. And so listening to them, listening to what they're going through, even if they're saying stuff that's hard for you to hear because you might not agree, it's still important to just hear where they're coming from, because you kind of have to just go through that whole process in your head. And praying for them, and then just encouraging them to not act impulsively. It's easy to think like, okay, I just want to take care of this right away. The doctors are pressuring me. Maybe I am crazy to be wanting to continue this pregnancy. But if anything, even if they still do decide to terminate, just not acting impulsively. There's nothing wrong with giving it time. That's not going to harm anything.
Are there resources that, I'm just thinking when they're on the sidewalk praying and if they're speaking to somebody, anything that, websites or anything that you guys know of? I mean, they could take copies of your book and give them out, but
yes.
That would be one thing. But other, Heather, I'm kind of looking at you too, of things that, are there any web-based resources that you could think of that they could go to or have, refer people to?
Absolutely. So I actually saw a booth with my friends at Stand Up Girl. That's a website where, a teenager or a woman who is facing an unplanned pregnancy or, that they're struggling with their pregnancy, it's a website that they will easily find, and it will direct them to a local pregnancy resource center, one that's closest to them. Also, an organization that I represent, Save the One, we have resources on there about the 1% relating to pregnancy, whether it be conceiving and rape or a fatal diagnosis, disability, those sorts of things. And I also always try to find out where they stand spiritually. Because if you are with someone who's more science-based or doesn't believe in God, they may think that you're that kind of classic stereotype that they've made us all to be. But the reality is there are many organizations that are science-based. Secular Pro-Life is an amazing organization. I work with them a lot. They are 100% science-based. They have all of the classic questions that you could think to ask, and they show it with science. The president of that organization is a lawyer, and so she has a really good, strong legal background. And then, there are many other places I could go on for days. New Wave Feminist, Personhood. These are all organizations that they can give you those simple, like, these are the common questions, here are some good answers, and then you can go research on your own and share it with the people and try to relate them with someone who is, against abortion that already kind of aligns with their beliefs. Or you can say, here's a bunch of resources, and let them kind of decide what to take from it.
Thank you. This question is kind of about the medical community. Do you feel Oregon doctors place much emphasis on the possible medical cost, not to you, but to the medical system, so abortion is their first choice?
I didn't feel that way at all. More just that we are seeking perfection, and so that it was just kind of crazy that we were considering continuing this when there was such a large chance of, our son being something that wasn't perfect. I don't know if you have something different to say.
So I have the opposite story, and I did feel that there is a lot of pressure from the medical community, not only for the financial reasons, but also, for them, they think it's common sense as far as practicality. You live far away, your baby's having lots of surgeries, the things are mounting up. And for Gideon, imagine my shock when I go to our Blue Cross and start looking at what they paid for, trying to figure out how much we owe. And I see that Blue Cross has paid over $1 million for our child to be here. And I did have friends that are doctors or nurses that asked me, is it worth it to go into debt? Is it worth it to keep him alive in this scenario? And I say, absolutely yes. Every person's life is valuable. If one of you guys walked into the ER and you needed help, we would help you. And so we don't think about, doctors they can't turn away a patient, right? We all have that right. They can't turn you away if you come in the ER and have a medical issue. And so that same logic I would apply towards the unborn child. So, like I said, some doctors definitely think that the financial burden is a logical reason not to maintain a life.
This question is for you, Heather. Why do you think there is so much pressure to end a pregnancy when there are complications? Doctors' job should be to fight for life.
I absolutely agree. Doctors should fight for life. They take an oath that they're going to protect people, that they're going to help heal them. And I personally believe that this has to do with medical malpractice lawsuits. There are doctors that have been sued and successfully, for the patients or the parents of the patient, where if they didn't offer or pressure abortion and then the baby was disabled, or I just saw recently this last year that there was a wrongful birth lawsuit that the parents, they weren't told about medical issues or weren't advised to abort. And I've also seen ones where there were a twin pregnancy and, it was in vitro fertilization and they wanted to abort but then couldn't. So there's all these weird lawsuits that people are winning. And so doctors are genuinely concerned. They could lose their license. They could lose everything if they don't offer this or pressure it, because we are a society of perfection. And so they feel they're supposed to provide that expectation.
We have one. I have a final question that is a little bit of a statement, but I think it's good. So I was 44 years old when the medical staff checked me and gave me a prescription to go to the lab around the block to get an amniocentesis because of my age. I said no. If something was wrong, I already knew I was not going to have an abortion. And thank God my friend had told me about complications of amniocentesis. My son is fine. So I think maybe comment on the importance of information and research and where do you guys, where did you go when, after sort of the medical community told you one thing, where did you go to find out information that helped you keep your babies safe?
Well, I did what you shouldn't do, and that is go to Google and Google everything about intrauterine growth restriction. And of course, you hear every horror story and everything awful that happened. And that's what also fueled me to write a book, just to encourage others that there are positive outcomes, or this happened to me and the doctors were wrong and that sort of thing. But, just asking other people who maybe have been through those situations, really finding out what amniocentesis means or what some type of blood test means, getting the facts straight, deciding what that means for you, because I know Heather had mentioned that we do tend to believe that whatever doctors say is gold and truth and absolute, and that you have no say, and you absolutely do have a say. You can choose what you want to do. It's your body, it's your child, it's your life, it's your future. And so just making sure that you think it through and find out the facts. For us, if we would have done the amniocentesis, I had mentioned that there's a risk that we could have gone into preterm labor. So there's always, there could be side effects to everything, and the doctors might not always tell you that. Fully equipped. Yes.
So, could you repeat the question one more time at the end there?
You want me to remember what I said?
Yes. Yes.
I think what I said was ideas for what kind of research did you do on your own after you heard the diagnosis from the doctor?
Can y'all tell I have 4 kids? I'm like a goldfish. I forget instantly. So with my case, as I like Dr. Google because I like to know what the possibilities are. I want to know the extreme yes or no. I want to be aware, because I believe that if you are educated and you are taking the time to educate yourself from unbiased sources on both sides, then you'll be able to not only better decision-wise, but you'll also have that opportunity to be strong in what you are saying to the doctors or providers. And I have a really great anti-abortion, pro-life doctor in Dallas, Texas, friend, and then also in Pensacola, Florida. And they both have said there's no reason with today's modern medicine that a woman should have an abortion. And so I asked them, where do I go to find this type of information? And you can, yes, Dr. Google, but also a lot of these organizations, that's what they have set up to do, is to educate the public. You can go on any of the, like Live Action or any of those pro-life organizations, and they'll link up with other stories. So for me, I never expected to be here in this situation. I didn't like being in front of people. I was scared to talk on stage. And what ultimately got me here was my son, Gideon. Live Action asked if they could share his story when we were on our way to Mayo Clinic, and I allowed them to. But I was really scared about, getting hate mail, getting messages saying that I should have just let him die, or that he's a burden, and why would I do this stupid choice? And I did. I got tons of those messages. Very hateful, mean messages. But I got one from a mom in Utah. And this mom in Utah, she was Googling and trying to find anything about her son and how she could keep him alive. And she found our Gideon's story, and her son had the same diagnosis, which is already super rare. And I had already told myself that if one baby is saved by sharing my story, which made me very uncomfortable, that it would be worth all of the hate mail. And she chose life for her baby, and he died 2 or 3 weeks later. But she said, because of you sharing your story, because of the stories of other families, because of the resources online, I got the opportunity to hold and see my baby. I got to bond with him. I got to nurse him. I got to do all of these things that, had I listened to the doctors, I would have been denied. And so, not only looking up online, but pregnancy resource centers are absolutely amazing. And in most big cities, there's at least one. We are very lucky up in Oregon, up here, there's a lot of pregnancy resource centers. And so getting the woman connected with them, making sure that she has unbiased sources for information, and being more educated is really key. Because if you're educated on the subject, you're less likely to have fear.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Samantha and Heather, for being with us today and sharing your story. Really appreciate you.